The Mr. Men Christmas by Roger Hargreaves. Every year the Mr. Men spend Christmas together, and every year they have an argument as to where they should go. Last year was just the same. Mr. Topsy-Turvy wanted to go to Australia, because he'd heard that it was an upside-down sort of a place. Mr. Greedy wanted to go to France, because he'd heard that the food there was rather good. Mr. Muddle wanted to go to the North Pole, because it would be nice and warm there. And Mr. Silly wanted to go to the moon. How silly! But every year they always finished up going to the same place, Mr. Uppity's house. This was partly because Mr. Uppity had the only house big enough for all the Mr. Men, and partly because Mr. Uppity wouldn't go anywhere else anyway. So, last year, as always, on Christmas Eve, all the Mr. Men arrived at Mr. Uppity's big house in Big Town. Mr. Silly ran all the way there. "I was too tired to walk," he explained. Because it was Christmas Eve, all the Mr. Men were very excited. Mr. Bounce kept on bouncing up and down, he was so excited. Mr. Noisy kept saying, "Happy Christmas!" to everybody in such a loud voice it made everybody jump. In fact, it made Mr. Silly jump out of his shoes. Mr. Topsy-Turvy kept on saying, "Christmas happy!" to everybody. And Mr. Greedy was seen to be licking his lips a lot and saying, "Turkey! Christmas cake! Mince pies and plum pudding!" over and over to himself. "Now, everybody," announced Mr. Uppity in an uppity fashion, "the first thing we need is a Christmas tree. So everybody follow me." Everybody looked at him. Can you guess what was happening? That's right, Mr. Tickle was tickling him. All the Mr. Men then followed Mr. Uppity, still being tickled, down to the bottom of his enormous garden, where there was a giant Christmas tree. Mr. Small looked up at it. "But how," he asked in his little voice, "are we going to get such a big tree back up to the house?" "Push it," said Mr. Dizzy. "Pull it," said Mr. Funny. "I know," said Mr. Silly. "Instead of carrying the tree up to the house, why don't we carry the house down to the tree?" Mr. Strong just smiled, and picked up that giant Christmas tree, and carried it up to the house with one hand. That afternoon they spent all afternoon decorating it. Mr. Tickle had to put the fairy on top, because he was the only one who could reach. It looked very beautiful. Mr. Sneeze looked at it. "Achoo!" He sneezed all the decorations off, every single one, so they had to do it all over again. That Christmas Eve, all the Mr. Men hung all their Christmas stockings up along Mr. Uppity's enormous fireplace. Can you guess which one is Mr. Topsy-Turvy's? And which one is Mr. Small's? And which one is Mr. Greedy's? And which two are Mr. Muddle's? And can you guess who came and looked in them all before he went to bed? Christmas morning came, and all the Mr. Men gave all the other Mr. Men their presents. Mr. Daydream gave Mr. Sneeze a box of handkerchiefs. Mr. Snow gave Mr. Messy a comb. Mr. Happy gave Mr. Lazy a cushion. Mr. Impossible gave Mr. Chatterbox a dictionary so that he could say even more words than he could already. Mr. Mean gave Mr. Forgetful a lump of coal, and Mr. Forgetful forgot to say thank you. But he did remember to give Mr. Small a new hat. But did he remember to make sure it was the right size? No. And Mr. Silly gave Mr. Uppity a very special present, a Nonsense-Land teapot. After that, they all went into Mr. Uppity's dining room to eat. Turkey, Christmas cake, mince pies, and plum pudding. And beside everybody's plate was a Christmas cracker. Mr. Topsy-Turvy and Mr. Happy pulled one of the crackers. Bang! Poor Mr. Jelly nearly jumped out of his skin and hid under the table. All the Christmas crackers had paper hats inside them, and all the Mr. Men put them on and tucked into their Christmas dinner. Mr. Greedy had 20 slices of turkey, then Christmas cake, 30 slices, then mince pies, 40 pies, then plum pudding. 1 minute it was there, the next minute it wasn't. "Delicious!" murmured Mr. Greedy, wiping away a crumb. That afternoon it snowed. Mr. Fussy looked out of the window. "Oh, what a terrible mess all that snow's making!" he said, and rushed outside to clear it all up, which of course he couldn't. Mr. Tickle discovered that his extraordinarily long arms were very useful for throwing snowballs, especially as he was sitting comfortably inside. Mr. Bump walked into a tree, and all the snow fell on top of him and turned him into a snowman. Mr. Bounce fell over and rolled down a hill in the snow and became a snowball. And you should have seen Mr. Topsy-Turvy on a toboggan. And guess who sang the loudest when they sang Christmas carols that evening? After that, Mr. Muddle thought that he'd like to say "Happy Christmas" to everybody. He opened his mouth. All the Mr. Men looked at him. "Happy birthday!" he said. Oh, Mr. Muddle. Happy Christmas. Thank you for listening.